Welcome to this deep dive into one of the most profound mysteries in science, the hard problem of consciousness. Before we tackle the hard problem, we need to understand what consciousness actually is. Consciousness is the subjective, first-person experience of what it's like to be you. It's the feeling of seeing red, tasting chocolate, or feeling pain. Philosophers call these experiences qualia. It's your inner mental life, the movie playing in your head that only you can access. The philosopher David Chalmers famously distinguished between the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, though still incredibly complex, involve explaining cognitive functions and behaviors. How does the brain process visual information? How do we learn and remember? These problems are called easy because we know in principle how to approach them using neuroscience, computation, and cognitive science. The hard problem is fundamentally different. It asks, why does any physical process give rise to subjective experience? Why doesn't all this brain activity happen in the dark, without any inner feeling? Here's the puzzle. On one side we have physical processes, neurons firing, chemical signals, electrical patterns. On the other side we have subjective experience, the feeling of redness, the taste of sweetness. The question is, how does one produce the other? This is what philosophers call the explanatory gap. There seems to be a fundamental gap between our physical descriptions and our subjective experiences. You might ask, can we measure consciousness scientifically? The answer is complicated. Neuroscience has made tremendous progress in identifying what are called neural correlates of consciousness, or NCCs. These are specific patterns of brain activity that reliably correlate with particular conscious experiences. For example, when you see the color red, specific neurons in your visual cortex area V4 become active. We can measure this with functional MRI, showing blood flow increases in that region. Functional MRI signal is proportional to blood oxygen level. More active neurons need more oxygen. Modern fMRI has a spatial resolution of about 1 to 3 millimeters. The temporal resolution is about 1 to 2 seconds, which is relatively slow compared to neural firing rates. But here's the critical issue. Finding neural correlates is not the same as explaining consciousness. Even if we perfectly map every brain state to every experience, we haven't explained why those brain states feel like anything. To illustrate the hard problem, philosophers use a thought experiment called the philosophical zombie. Imagine a creature that is physically and functionally identical to you in every way. Same neurons, same behavior, same responses. But there's no inner experience. No lights are on inside. Would this zombie behave any differently than you? According to the thought experiment, no. It would say, I'm conscious. Describe its experiences. Pass any behavioral test. This thought experiment suggests that consciousness is something over and above physical function. If a zombie is conceivable, then consciousness can't be fully explained by physics alone. Another famous thought experiment is the knowledge argument, also known as Mary's room. Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who knows everything physical about color vision. She knows all the wavelengths, all the neural pathways, every equation. But she's lived her entire life in a black and white room. Mary knows all the physical facts. She can tell you exactly what happens in your brain when you see red at 650 nanometers wavelength. The question is, when Mary finally leaves the room and sees red for the first time, does she learn something new? The intuition is, yes, she learns what red actually feels like. This is knowledge that can't be captured by physical descriptions alone. So what are the proposed solutions to the hard problem? There are several major approaches in philosophy and neuroscience. The first approach is materialism or physicalism. This view says consciousness is nothing but physical processes. Identity theory claims that mental states are literally identical to brain states. When you feel pain, that is nothing but C fibers firing. Functionalism says consciousness is defined by functional roles. It's not about the physical substrate, but about the computational or causal relationships. The problem is, these theories still don't explain why these physical or functional states should have subjective qualities. They describe the mechanism but not the experience. The second approach is dualism, most famously defended by Descartes. Dualism claims that mind and brain are fundamentally different kinds of things. Physical stuff and mental stuff are distinct. But dualism faces a huge problem, the interaction problem. If mind and matter are so different, how do they causally interact? How does your immaterial thought cause your physical arm to move? Most modern scientists reject dualism because we have no mechanism for this interaction, and it violates conservation of energy. A third approach that's gaining some attention is pansychism. Pansychism claims that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or charge. It's not something that emerges only in complex brains. On this view, even elementary particles might have extremely simple forms of experience. Human consciousness is just a very complex combination of these basic conscious elements. But pansychism faces the combination problem. How do millions of tiny conscious experiences combine into one unified human consciousness? This is deeply puzzling. A more radical approach is illusionism, defended by philosophers like Daniel Dennett. Illusionism claims there is no hard problem because phenomenal consciousness, as traditionally conceived, doesn't actually exist. It's an illusion created by the brain. We think we have these ineffable inner experiences that can't be captured physically, but that's just the brain fooling us. There's really nothing there beyond the physical processes. This view is deeply counterintuitive because consciousness seems like the most certain thing we know. Descartes, I think therefore I am, seems impossible to deny. Now let's look at one of the most prominent scientific theories attempting to solve the hard problem, integrated information theory, or IIT. IIT was developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi and is one of the few theories that directly tackles the hard problem with mathematical rigor. The core idea is that consciousness is integrated information. A system is conscious to the extent that it integrates information. The theory introduces a quantity called phi, which measures the amount of integrated information in a system. Phi measures how much the whole system is more than the sum of its parts. It quantifies the irreducibility of the system to independent components. According to IIT, if phi is greater than 0, the system has some degree of consciousness. The higher the phi, the more conscious it is. For example, isolated neurons have phi equal to 0 because they don't integrate information, but a highly connected network has high phi and therefore consciousness. IIT makes several testable predictions. For instance, it predicts that the cerebellum, despite having many neurons, has low phi because of its feed-forward architecture. The cerebellum has 69 billion neurons, more than the cerebral cortex, but it contributes little to consciousness because information doesn't integrate across its modules. The cerebral cortex has only about 16 billion neurons, but the cerebellum has 69 billion neurons, more than 4 times as many. Yet, the cortex generates consciousness while the cerebellum doesn't. IIT explains this. The cortex has high integration, the cerebellum has low integration. However, IIT still faces a version of the hard problem. Even if we accept that consciousness correlates with integrated information, why should integrated information feel like anything? This is still mysterious. Another major theory is global workspace theory, developed by Bernard Bars. GWT uses a theater metaphor. Consciousness is like a spotlight on a stage. Information that enters the spotlight becomes conscious, while backstage processes remain unconscious. Many specialized unconscious modules compete for access to the global workspace. When information wins this competition and enters the workspace, it becomes conscious and is broadcast to all other modules. GWT is good at explaining what's called access consciousness, which information we can report and act on, but it doesn't explain phenomenal consciousness, what it feels like. This raises a fascinating question. Can we build conscious artificial intelligence? And how would we even know if we succeeded? This brings us to the problem of other minds, which is closely related to the hard problem. You have direct access only to your own consciousness. You can't directly experience what it's like to be someone else, or a bat, or a computer. We infer that other humans are conscious by analogy. They have similar brains, similar behaviors, and they report having experiences like ours. But for AI systems, or animals with very different brain structures, this inference becomes much more uncertain. Is an octopus conscious, What about a large language model? The Turing test, which measures whether I can fool a human, is not a test for consciousness. A system could pass the Turing test without being conscious, like a philosophical zombie. Despite these philosophical puzzles, neuroscience has developed practical ways to assess consciousness, particularly in clinical settings. The Glasgow Coma Scale assesses consciousness based on eye opening, verbal response, and motor response. Scores range from 3 to 15. GCS score equals eye response plus verbal response plus motor response. Scores range from 3, which is completely unresponsive, to 15, which is fully awake and alert. But behavior-based measures can fail. In locked-in syndrome, patients are fully conscious but completely paralyzed. They appear unconscious by behavioral tests. More sophisticated measures look directly at brain activity. EEG complexity measures, like the Perturbational Complexity Index, can detect consciousness even without behavioral responses. The Perturbational Complexity Index measures how complex the brain's response is to a magnetic pulse. A PCI value greater than 0.31 reliably indicates consciousness, even in patients who can't move or speak. Studying altered states of consciousness provides crucial insights into how consciousness works. During deep sleep, consciousness is greatly reduced or absent, yet the brain is still very active. This shows that neural activity alone is not sufficient for consciousness. During REM sleep and dreaming, we have vivid conscious experiences, despite being disconnected from sensory input. This shows consciousness can be generated internally. General anesthesia causes a reversible loss of consciousness. Different anesthetics work by different mechanisms, disrupting neural integration. Propofol, a common anesthetic, requires about 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram of body weight to induce unconsciousness. Psychedelic drugs like LSD or psilocybin don't reduce consciousness, but profoundly alter it. They increase entropy in brain activity and disrupt the default mode network. Recent research has identified a brain network that's crucial for self-awareness, the default mode network, or DMN. The DMN is most active when the mind is at rest, not focused on external tasks. It's involved in self-referential thinking, memory, and imagination. Key regions include the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. These regions are highly connected and active during rest. Psychedelics strongly suppress the DMN, which correlates with ego dissolution, the feeling that the boundary between self and world has disappeared. This suggests that our sense of having a unified self is constructed by the brain. It's not a fundamental feature of consciousness, but something the DMN creates. Another deep puzzle in consciousness research is the binding problem. When you see a red ball, color is processed in area V4, shape in areas V1 and V2, and motion in area V5. These are physically separate brain regions. Yet you experience a single unified object, a red ball, not separate patches of redness and roundness. How does the brain bind these features together? One proposed solution is neural synchrony. Neurons representing different features of the same object fire in synchrony at about 40 Hz in the gamma frequency band. Gamma oscillations range from about 30 to 100 Hz, with 40 Hz being particularly important for consciousness. Neurons that fire together in this gamma rhythm may represent features that belong to the same object, solving the binding problem through temporal coordination. All of this research has profound implications for artificial intelligence and the possibility of machine consciousness. Current AI systems, even sophisticated ones like large language models, lack many features we associate with consciousness. They don't integrate information like IIT predicts, and they lack a global workspace. However, we can't definitively rule out that advanced AI might be conscious. We don't fully understand what physical features are necessary and sufficient for consciousness. If pansychism is correct, even simple computational systems might have primitive forms of consciousness, but this seems to lead to absurd conclusions. Before we create AI that might be conscious, we urgently need better theories of consciousness. Otherwise, we risk creating suffering beings without realizing it, or missing consciousness where it exists. The heart problem has profound ethical implications that we're only beginning to grapple with. If only conscious beings can suffer or experience well-being, then consciousness is the foundation of all ethics. Only conscious entities have moral status. Our uncertainty about animal consciousness directly affects how we should treat animals. If fish are conscious, factory farming fish is deeply wrong. But we don't know for sure. Potential AI consciousness raises entirely new ethical challenges. If we create conscious AI, do we have obligations to it? Can we turn it off? These questions are no longer science fiction. So why does the hard problem matter beyond academic philosophy? The hard problem isn't just philosophical speculation. It directly affects clinical medicine, AI development, animal welfare, and fundamental ethics. We can't reliably measure or detect consciousness if we don't understand what it is. This affects diagnosis of disorders of consciousness, assessment of AI systems, and evaluation of animal welfare. Some researchers, like Roger Penrose, argue that understanding consciousness may require entirely new physics, possibly involving quantum mechanics in the brain. Others argue we may need to accept that subjective experience is an irreducible fundamental feature of reality, not explainable in terms of anything more basic. Where does the field stand today on the hard problem? We've made tremendous progress in identifying neural correlates of consciousness. We can predict with reasonable accuracy when someone is conscious based on brain activity. We have mathematically rigorous testable theories like IIT and GWT that make specific predictions about consciousness. Yet the fundamental hard problem remains unsolved. We still don't have a widely accepted explanation for why physical processes produce subjective experience. Some philosophers and scientists think the hard problem is permanently unsolvable by human minds. It's not just currently unknown, but unknowable, a mystery rather than a puzzle. Others are more optimistic, believing that with enough research, we'll find a satisfying explanation, perhaps by revising our concepts of both physics and experience. So where does this leave us? Consciousness is simultaneously the most obvious thing in your life and the most mysterious. You know it exists because you experience it directly, yet we can't explain it. Science has revealed incredible details about how the brain works, but hasn't fundamentally solved the hard problem of why there's something it's like to be a brain. The deepest question remains: why does the universe, or at least some parts of it, have an inside, a subjective perspective? Why isn't everything just physical processes in the dark? Understanding consciousness may be the deepest question in all of science, touching on physics, biology, philosophy, and what it means to be human.